Let me start off by talking about the pandemics. Pandemics are not specific to a specific country. Let us be clear what's going on here. There is a clear relationship between the escalating number of pandemics we have had over the last many years and climate change. We've had 5 major pandemics over the last decade, and there's going to be more. And the reason is twofold. First, it has to do with economic development. We have begun to encroach upon the rest of the planets and the wild parts of our Earth. You know, a century ago, about 80% of the planet was still wild, still wilderness. Today, only 23% of the entire Earth is still wilderness. The rest is under human development. Our UN bodies tell us that we are now using 1.5 Earths in terms of human economic development. So what's happening as the wilderness shrivels, it means that the wildlife is coming closer to human civilization. And that is causing more interactions and pandemics. At the same time, climate change is now inducing more pandemics. We are seeing, as the temperature rises on this planet, we are seeing a change in the water cycles, the hydrological cycles, more dramatic snows in the winter, more spring flooding around the world in the spring, more summer droughts and wildfires, more fall hurricanes and typhoons. And so what's happening is our ecosystems cannot catch up to this runaway shift in the water cycle, and they are collapsing in real time. What this means is mass migrations. Human beings are migrating. The wild animals are migrating as well. And now the viruses are hitching a ride on the animals and migrating too. So we have human migration, animal migration, and virus migration, and more encroachment on human society. So we will see more pandemics. The issue is, can we take this existing crisis and turn it into an opportunity? We need now to look at a long-term recovery, a 1,000-year recovery that will allow us to completely change the way human beings interact on this earth. We have one country now in official policy who has begun to make this move. It's the People's Republic of China. You made an historic change in your constitution, and you're the first country that's done this, that said that all future development in China must adhere to the principles of nature. You call this the ecological civilization, that all development, social and economic development, must be in tandem and be congenial to the principles that allow life to flourish on this earth, to nature itself. This is the first time any nation in history has declared this as a principle of its future governance. So we are beginning to see a dramatic change. But let me say this, even before this existing pandemic, we had realized that growth, GDP in the world has been slowing now for 20 years because we're living on an old, tired, outdated infrastructure of industrial revolution of the 20th century. And so GDP is slowing because productivity has been declining for the past several decades. The result is we have a deteriorating global economy, we have increasing pandemics, and we now have real-time climate change. Our scientists are telling us that we are now in the 6th extinction event of life on Earth. It doesn't even make the headlines. This is the most important moment in human history, in our 200,000 years of modern human beings being on this planet. Our scientists say that we've had 5 major extinction events in the last 450 million years. And each time there was massive die out and millions of years to recover with new life. We are now in the sixth extinction event, and everyone in China needs to listen to this, as well as my fellow Americans. Our scientists tell us we could lose over half the species on Earth in the next 8 decades. The last time we had an extinction event of this magnitude was 65 million years ago. There are young babies in China, in America, in Europe, in Africa, and Asia today who will be here in 8 decades from now. So we are in a crisis, and we need now to create a new narrative, a new vision for the world. So we need to look back and ask, how do the great economic paradigms in history occur? If we know how they occur, we're going to get a roadmap in China and the rest of the world and a compass to navigate a new journey for the human race, hopefully to address climate change, to create a more sustainable, resilient society, to create what China calls the ecological civilization and what we call in Europe the Green New Deal. So there have been at least 7 major economic paradigm shifts in history. They're very interesting. They each share a common denominator, and that is at a moment of time, 3 defining technologies emerge across a civilization and converge to create an infrastructure that fundamentally changes the way humanity communicates, powers its society, and moves its people across the economic and social realms. What are those 3 technology revolutions that changed civilization in history? Number 1, new communication revolutions that can bring larger numbers of people together in more diverse, complex relationships to manage their day-to-day life. Number 2, new sources of power and energy to allow larger, complex, and diverse populations to engage in economic and social life. Number 3, new modes of mobility and logistics to allow us to move larger numbers of people around and engage in economic and social life and governance. When communication revolutions converge with new energy revolutions, which in turn converge with mobility and logistics revolution, it changes our temporal spatial orientation. It brings large numbers of people together in complex, civilized environments. It changes our business models. It changes our governance. I'll give you 2 examples. In the 19th century, the first industrial revolution in Britain, the communication revolution was steam-powered printing and the telegraph. And then the new energy regime was coal. And the new mobility was railroads across national domains. This communication, energy, and mobility infrastructure changed our built environment. We went to large, urban, dense, and urban environments. It gave us national markets, nation-state governance. The 20th century, a second industrial revolution in the United States, another communication, energy, mobility, and logistics shift. The communication revolution was the telephone, as important as the internet today, bringing large numbers of people together over time and space. The new energy regime in the US and the second industrial revolution was cheap oil, Texas oil. And the new mobility and logistics revolution was the internal combustion engine. Henry Ford put out millions of vehicles, and we brought people together. This second industrial revolution took us from urban to suburban building habitats. We went from national markets to globalization and new governing institutions like the OECD, the IMF, the World Bank, the UN. This second industrial revolution based on fossil fuels is now dying. It's dying in real time. We are now, however, on the cusp of a third industrial revolution, and I will say it's being led by the European Union and the People's Republic of China. Be very clear. It is not being led by the United States at this point. So this puts a big responsibility on these 2 great superpowers. Here's the revolution, and if this becomes clear to everyone here, it's because you are engaged in it. You are leading the world in this. The communication revolution is the internet. We now have 4.5 billion people connected with cheap cell phones in real time, communicating across distance and bringing humanity together all around the world. Now this digital revolution in communication is now converging with a second digital revolution, and that is a digitized energy internet, which is going to allow millions and millions of people in their homes, in their neighborhoods, in their local businesses to produce their own solar and wind energy and electricity, and then share it across national and continental electricity internets, sharing solar and wind electricity across continents using the same digital technology we use now to share information, news, and knowledge on our communication internet. The two internets are converging. Now these two internets, the communication internet and now the continental energy and electricity internets, are converging with a third internet. And this is a mobility and logistics internet. It's all digitized, and it's made up increasingly of electric and fuel cell transportation vehicles powered by solar and wind electricity from the energy internet, and using the same big data and algorithm governance that we use for news, knowledge, and entertainment on the communication internet, we're now using to help steer autonomous transportation on the electricity internet. These two internets, these three internets, communication internet, the electricity internet, and the mobility internet, are riding atop a platform, the Internet of Things. All of our buildings, residential, commercial, industrial buildings, are going to be retrofitted to make them resilient to climate change events. They are then being transformed into nodes, N-O-D-E-S. These nodes will have edge data centers, so across China and the world, there will be data centers to store data everywhere. And they will also be, every building will also be a micro power generation site for solar electricity. Every building becomes a charging station for your electric vehicles and a storage battery for your energy. The buildings of the Internet Things connect up to the communication internet, the electricity internet, the mobility internet, and create, if you will, a new infrastructure to communicate, to power, and to move economic and social life across China, and hopefully by extension with the Belt and Road Initiative across the world. This, in a sense, is the framework in which we see the future. So in Europe, we have what we call a two-part plan. And I've been privileged to work with the leadership of the European Union for the last 20 years leading up to this plan. Our plan is Digital Europe and the New Green Deal. We are bringing digital infrastructure together with a Green New Deal to transform society and create a more sustainable relationship to the ecology of the planet. So this is where we're going. And I would say this, what we are seeing now in Europe is that the major sectors are now decoupling from the fossil fuel civilization. And this is very important for China to hear. All right? So this is very important for China to hear. The energy sector is now decoupling from fossil fuels. And here's the reason why. What we learned in Europe is that when solar and wind electricity became cheaper, it created a crisis for the fossil fuel civilization. As of 2019, the levelized cost of solar and wind electricity have now plunged below the cost of nuclear, oil, coal, and natural gas. I want everyone to hear this in China. We are now seeing the utility scale solar and wind as the cheapest energy in the world in real time as of 2019. What this means is that Citibank a number of years ago saw this happening, and they said we could be sitting on $100 trillion in stranded fossil fuel assets because solar and wind are now cheaper and the market is speaking. When we mean stranded assets, we mean all of the coal, oil, and gas that will never be taken out of the ground because it will not amortize out because solar and wind is now cheaper. It's all of the pipelines that we will not need because solar and wind is cheaper. All the refineries that will be abandoned. So we're looking at the largest bubble in history, an economic bubble. It's the carbon bubble. And the new studies and reports that we have in the book that's now been published in China, these reports are in the last 18 months from the banking community, the insurance industry, the various sectors of the economy. And they're reporting that we may see the collapse of the fossil fuel civilization with a carbon bubble with trillions of dollars of standard assets somewhere around 2028. So this is an inflection point. And what we've learned in Europe is that it's moving very quickly, and also in China. So my hope here today is that we can have a robust conversation and learn from China, because in your 13th five-year plan, you began to move toward this idea of a zero carbon society. Now in your 14th five-year plan, we're hoping that China will bring all of this together and lay out, to show the world by laying out an infrastructure across China that's totally digital, to bring together communication, renewable energy, mobility and logistics, and the Internet of Things across the building environment, to create the new businesses and the new jobs, and to take us to a zero carbon society. And what you call the ecological civilization, and what we in Europe and now increasingly in America call the Green New Deal. So it's a tremendous opportunity and responsibility. But I will say this in closing: we're not going back to where we used to be. We're not going to be able to see the world that we knew for the last 10,000 years. We are moving from the age of progress, a Western idea, to the ecological civilization and the age of resilience. China will have to help us around the world understand how we become more resilient, how we change our vision of the world so we learn to be more self-sustainable, how we can move from globalization to glocalization. We still connect around the world, but China can show us how we can be resilient and self-sufficient when needed in our own communities. China needs to help show us how we can protect our community's biosphere in every region of China. China needs to help us also understand how we can begin to move from a geopolitical world based on protecting fossil fuels. And you know, millions of people have died in 2 world wars to protect fossil fuels. We now need China to help us move from a geopolitical world to a biosphere world that's in tandem with, if you will, the principles of an ecological civilization. So I'm hoping that that will be a helpful beginning of a conversation this morning. Let me talk about one thing that was just mentioned, and that is we need a new vision and a new social understanding of humanity's relationship to the planet. There's a big difference between our vision in the West and your vision in the eastern part of this planet over the last 2,000 years about human beings' relationship to nature. And in the West, we have believed through our religious traditions, our Hebraic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. We've learned in our religious traditions that nature is here for human beings to dominate. And in the book of Genesis, it talks about how God allowed Adam and Eve to name the animals, and God said, "You shall have dominion over the animals. They are here for your use." So if you take a look at the last 2,000 years of Western history, there's always been this focus that the rest of nature is here as a resource, that it's passive, that it's there to be controlled for the actual enjoyment and pleasure and advancement of human beings. So there's always been a separation between human beings, the dominant force, and nature, the passive resource. In the Asian tradition, in Confucianism and in Buddhism and in many of the Asian traditions, Nature is not seen as a resource. Confucius and his disciples said that humans are part of nature, that we do not dominate. We need to actually harmonize with the natural world around us. And so if you take a look at the next 1,000 years, there is in the cultural DNA of China and the East and Asia a different view, and that cultural DNA that human beings have always been a part of and must harmonize with our fellow creatures, our environment, our ecosystems in the natural world. So it should not have been a surprise to civilization that China was the first country in its constitution to call for an ecological civilization. Now, we have woken up to that reality in Europe. In the last 20 years, as I've worked with the leadership of the European Union and our heads of state, we have come also to believe that human beings are one of many agents in nature. Nature is full of agency, and that we need to learn to live with and to listen to and to respect and to be a good partner with the natural world. We call this the Green New Deal. What's interesting to me is our young people are waking up. I've been very heartened by these Friday for Future events, where in the last year and a half, millions and millions of young people in 141 nations left their schoolrooms, left their local businesses, and peacefully walked out into the street and called for a climate emergency and for a Green New Deal. And what's interesting about these very peaceful protests is that they reflect a shift in consciousness, and you see it also in Asia. And that shift in consciousness is this. We've had protests all through history, but this is the first time we've seen two generations of human beings. That's the millennials and Gen Zs across every country. And they're now thinking as a species. They're not thinking in terms of their own personal interest or their own political interests or their own business interests, but they're beginning to see themselves as an endangered species. Our young people in China and around the world are beginning to see themselves as a species. And they're beginning to perceive their fellow creatures as part of their evolutionary family. And if they're imperiled, we're imperiled. And we have a young generation in China and around the world who are beginning to understand that the biosphere is our indivisible community, that we live and we flourish by our ability to harmonize, as the Chinese tradition would say, with the natural world. So what we're beginning to see is a global shift in consciousness from a geopolitical world based on protecting fossil fuels and the interest of the very well-off. Now we're moving to a biosphere consciousness, where young people in China around the world are beginning to understand what China means by the ecological civilization. So I think that Asia is in good stead to lead this new revolution. But I would say this, in Europe, our Green New Deal, our digital Europe, has been a forerunner. And I suspect that what we're going to see in the future is a coming together of the European Union and the People's Republic of China. And depending on what happens in the United States, maybe next year we will also see the United States join. We need all three of these great superpowers to understand that the digital Green New Deal and China's Internet Plus ecological civilization are basically the same vision. They're the same game plan. And if we can begin to understand that, we can lay out this infrastructure. We have just finished a report that has not been published yet. I brought together the leading industries and businesses in America who will know how to put this transition in place. And in this report, here's what we see. And this is true everywhere. We need to lay out in the United States and Europe and China, each continent needs to lay out a high volume, distributed current, power grid, and energy internet, so that across continents, everyone can produce their own solar and wind electricity where they work, where they live, in their neighborhoods. And what they're not using, they can share back on a continental and hopefully across oceans, digital internet, so that we begin to share the energy of the world, solar and wind. So when the sun is shining in one part of the world, you can share that electricity with another part of the world. When the wind is blowing in one continent, we can store it and share it with another continent. This takes us to a shared biosphere. This brings humanity into a shared, if you will, space. I think that the Belt Road Initiative is an interesting introduction to where we could go. And I'm hoping in the future that the European Union and China would share a common landmass, the largest in the world, Eurasia, can work together. We have differences. There are things that have to be ironed out. But the big picture, Europe is China's largest trading partner. China is Europe's second largest trading partner and about to be their first. I have no doubt that Europe and China will come closer together and lead the world into a new infrastructure, a global Belt and Road infrastructure, if you will, that will allow us to begin to see that we live on one planet. Last thing, what we've learned here with this pandemic and what we've learned with climate events is that no one can be spared and no one can be isolated. That everything each of us does in our own life, how we live, how we consume, how we deal with equality and poverty, everything that we do in our day-to-day life affects someone else, some other family, some other species, some other ecosystems around the world. The lesson we're learning is we are all interconnected. That's the lesson of climate change. That's the lesson of pandemics, that each of our individual survival depends on how we relate to and share this earth with each of our other human beings, our fellow creatures, and the ecosystems that we live. If we can learn that lesson, we can then begin to create a resilient society. The age of progress was only for a few on the planet. The coming age of resilience means that everyone needs to be responsible for their own country and their own communities and their own neighborhoods and their biosphere. But together we share, if you will, our relationship with each other and learn to live with our fellow creatures. This is what we mean by an ecological civilization. And it's a digital interconnectivity of the entire human race across the planet. Let me discuss what we've learned in Europe, because it's a lesson that others hopefully will need to know. What we found is that when the levelized cost of solar and wind became competitive and cheaper, the utility scale solar and wind became cheaper than natural gas, way cheaper than coal and nuclear. What we found was this, and it started in Germany. As you know, I worked with Germany on this transition as well as the EU. Back around 2006 or 7, maybe only about a few percentage points of the electricity was solar and wind. 93, 94, 95% was the old fossil fuels and nuclear power. So the power companies did not think that there was much competition here. What they didn't realize is that when we began to put in feed-in tariffs and that dropped the price and technology began to move exponentially, solar and wind plummeted in price. It used to cost $78 fixed cost for one solar watt. Today it's 43 cents, one fixed watt. In 18 months from now, it'll be 35 cents. We now have power and utility companies in America and Europe quietly buying long-term 20-year contracts for solar and wind at 5 cents, 4 cents, 3 cents, 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour. So what we learned in Germany is it's not so important. This is important to people here. It's not so important how big the incumbent is, let's say in the electricity grid, fossil fuel and nuclear. It's how fast the challenger, solar and wind, is moving into the grid. In other words, when electricity started to compete with gas lighting a century ago, when electricity got to 3% of the lighting, it was over, because the investment community saw that the new challenger was moving so quick that the old gas lighting would not be there and the investment shifted. What we learned in Germany, when solar and wind got to 14% of the electricity, 86% of the electricity is still fossil fuel nuclear. It was over because solar and wind were getting so cheap and moving so quick that investment started to see that the old energies were stranded. They would never pay back their investments. We lost hundreds of billions of euros because we didn't see this inflection point. It's 14%. And this is the guide you can use. When the United States now is very quickly going to 14%, 14% of our electricity will be solar and wind in 2022 or 23. It'll be over. Globally, 14% of all the electricity in the world will be solar and wind by 2028. That's the inflection point. So we're already seeing the decoupling. So the key is to minimize the losses and find a way, a just transition for the old energies, get them out quick. We believe in the new report that we have not published that I've done with American industry, we believe we can put this whole grid in 20 years. It can be done. Now, what's happened is let's look at mobility. Today, it's still internal combustion transport. Electric vehicles are only 2% of electric mobility, and it's all being moved by China. China is moving the electric vehicles forward. By 2023, according to the studies we have in our book from industry, these are not my studies. By 2023, electric vehicles will be competitive with no subsidy with internal combustion vehicles. By 2025, they will be cheaper, electric and fuel cell vehicles. By 2028, 20% of the sales of vehicles in the world will be electric vehicles by 2028. Now, why this is important? We produce 92 million barrels of oil in the world each day. We consume them. 65% of those, 63% of all the oil we consume every day goes to transport. So what you can begin to see is this is going to happen. The market's too powerful. There will be nothing to stop it. So countries that are really dependent on fossil fuels need to really minimize the stranded assets and quickly move in to a digitized, if you will, infrastructure that can bring us into the new world. Secondly, you mentioned a new way of organizing this. In the report we have not published yet here, my colleagues, we believe that the electricity grid, the national grid, has to be a high-volume, distributed energy internet. So you can bring large-scale solar and wind from the west to the east and the east to the west. But we believe that half of the new energy, electricity, will be local, microgrids. In other words, we believe there has to be, and I want you to hear this, 70 million microgrids in the United States. Every home, every neighborhood, every office, every technology park, 70 million microgrids, and they will produce half the electricity. The large utility scale solar and wind will be the other half of the electricity. So what we see is the reason we need to do this is you need a high volume distributed national electricity internet connecting to alternative current internets, connecting to microgrids. Why is this important? This is about resilience. We will increasingly be facing climate events in China and every other country, droughts, floods, wildfires. They're going to get more severe. That means if the power lines go down, if your national power lines go down, and they should all be cable, underground, everything should go underground now. But if your power system goes down, it allows every local community, every neighborhood with microgrids to re-aggregate at a moment's notice, reassemble, distribute it, and share their electricity across their neighborhood, their community, and their region, so you never keep the lights never go off. The electricity stays on. So this is what we mean by shifting from short-term efficiency to long-term resilience. This is the lesson we're learning with the pandemics. You have to have long-term resilience. So China now needs to take its expertise to create a digitized third industrial revolution resilient infrastructure so that if you do face increasing problems with either climate events or other problems, you can reaggregate and share electricity locally and then go back onto a national electricity internet when you've recovered from disasters, from climate change. These are all crucial. So I think it's a big journey. I think you're right that there's a lot of issues in the way. If you had agreement at the national level in China and at the region, same in Europe, to quickly create the new regulations, the new standards, the new protocols that would allow you to integrate all this infrastructure, it can be put in 20 years, a zero carbon third industrial revolution infrastructure. It can be done in 20 years, but you need to have a unity and a coherence in your codes, regulations, and standards across all of your regions. Secondly, we've learned that this infrastructure has to be put in by the regions. In Europe, the continental Europe and the nation states create the incentives, the narrative, the codes, and the standards, but our hundreds of regions have to deploy the infrastructure, their local businesses. So same in China, as I know, China is very competitive. Your regions, and I love this aspect of China, it's very much like we have it. The regions are very competitive. Everyone wants to be best in show. This is a good thing. And they have expertise. So the national government rightly has set up the narrative, the ecological civilization. It set up the game plan, a digital internet plus third industrial revolution. It's setting up the vision of an ecological civilization. But now it needs to find a way to create the incentives so that the local regions, the governing regions of China, can begin to deploy a common infrastructure customized to their region, but connected across China. That will also be the Belt Road. China as the testing ground to show this will work. So you can create a resilient China where your local regions are fairly self-sustainable within a national setting. Then China can take that idea of the Belt Road, the digital Belt Road, the green Belt Road, the ecological civilization, and work with Europe together to cross Eurasia. Hopefully, next January, our next elections, we bring the United States in, and China can teach us now. You have many things to teach us from your experience in the 13th five-year plan, and so does Europe. Together, the three of us, I think, can do some really important things in terms of shifting the narrative and creating a resilience of civilization. Let me just say a few things in passing. You mentioned hydrogen power. And there's a lot of conversation now in Europe is now declaring they want to be a hydrogen power, and now South Korea and other places. I wrote a book called The Hydrogen Economy in 2000. It was a book I published then. And then I worked with Romano Prodi, who was president of the European Commission at that time. And we introduced a research and development of several $100 million to begin the hydrogen development. Then I talked with Chancellor Merkel, and I asked her to also begin the development R&D for hydrogen development. That was a long time ago, 18 years ago. We're now ready. Hydrogen is going to be increasingly important to store green energy, solar and wind. The interesting thing here about this transition is that it can really increase our economic well-being. The report that I mentioned to you earlier that we have not published yet, in the United States, we believe that we can put this whole infrastructure in 20 years if we have the new codes, regulations, and standards. Secondly, we think that for every dollar we invest in this new infrastructure, our economic modeling shows we'll get a return of approximately $3.4 in GDP. For every dollar we invest in this digital Green New Deal infrastructure, we're going to get $3.50 increased GDP. We believe that GDP, the business as usual model, says GDP in the next 20 years will be about 1.8, 1.9%. We believe with the new infrastructure, it'll be around 2.2 to 2.3%. We believe in the studies that we have done that we will save trillions and trillions of dollars. The estimate is somewhere around 10 to 15 trillion dollars in environmental costs we've saved because we've mitigated the damage from climate change. and trillions of dollars in health costs from increasing pandemics. So the infrastructure to create a more resilient ecological civilization gives us a more efficient economy, but also an economy that uses less of the Earth's resources and uses it in a much more sharing way. So, but the key is to get the infrastructure in. Let me mention something about funding as well. There's a lot of conversation now about how do you fund this? Well, part of it will come from government, for sure. But there's also a huge amount of money available from the pension funds around the world and insurance funds and institutional funds. You know, pension funds, that's the workers' money. That's the deferred savings of millions of employees like you have in China that are then invested for their retirement. People may be surprised in China as they are in America to know that the largest pool of capital in the world is the workers' money. It's called pension funds. It's $41 trillion. The largest pool of capital in the world is the workers' money. And we also have insurance funds. That's $25 trillion. We believe that public pension funds and citizens' pension funds can be invested with long-term green bonds issued by green banks. And that investment over 20 years to lay out the infrastructure, the people's money, returns to them the interest on that so they secure their retirement. So I know that there's a robust conversation in China about rethinking your pension plans for the country, rethinking them. So what would be interesting is how this generation in China can invest those pension funds, that's their earnings, in long-term bonds that can return good investment to them and then prepare a future for their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren in an ecological civilization. It's a virtuous circle. Secondly, you want to set up green banks to issue these bonds. This is happening in Europe. It's going to happen around the world. And I know China's rethinking its pension policies. This should be part of the conversation, how to invest those funds in pursuing a ecological civilization, a digital third industrial revolution. Secondly, you have a business model in China that will change the world. And I should say it's beyond capitalism. It's called energy service companies, ESCOs, energy service companies. This plan emerged in Europe and the US, but now China has become the leader in energy service companies. You know, in traditional capitalism, you have sellers, you have buyers, you have a market, you exchange. But in traditional capitalism, it's unequal because the seller always knows more than the buyer, always. The buyer, if the buyer knew everything the seller knew, you'd have a different arrangement. With ESCOs, all of the responsibility stays with the enterprise. It can be state companies, it can be private enterprise, but they're responsible for financing of some of this infrastructure with green bonds. You issue green bonds, energy service companies are financed. They have to lay out and help lay out the infrastructure in local communities, your local businesses, your SMEs, your local governments. And those businesses finance some of this infrastructure. They're responsible. And how they get paid back is by the efficiencies they secure. They can lay out parts of your electricity internet locally. They can lay out parts of your microgrid infrastructure locally. They can lay out some of your mobility and logistics infrastructure locally. They can help buildings be retrofitted so that they increase their aggregate efficiency and reduce their cost, and they get paid back by the energy savings. They get paid back by the efficiencies gained. So the responsibility lies with these companies, whether they're state or private, and they're responsible for a provider-user network. They secure all of these aggregate efficiencies and are paid back by the returns in the efficiencies they secure, performance contracts. This takes us beyond traditional capitalism, but it allows us to keep the best of enterprise. It allows us to keep the best of local businesses and cooperatives. And this is something, it doesn't surprise me that China has taken the ESCO and moved it beyond what we did in Europe and the US because it more fits this idea of all of us responsible for each other in the economy. That's truly part of a new third industrial revolution digital future. In terms of the last content and contribution, let me say a few things. I do agree that we need to have a global agreement emerging so we can share the sun and the wind all over the world. Because again, this is the way it's going to happen. We already are in studies on laying out cable systems under the ocean between Europe and America, from Alaska to Chile. They're talking about now a continental internet, from Africa to Europe, and of course from China to Eurasia, and from Shanghai to Rotterdam. I will also tell you that this internet has to go underground. You need to put this into your 14th five-year plan. You need to put cable underground in order to be resilient against climate change events. So the more you have these grids above ground, the less resilient you're going to be. Secondly, it is important to have a protocol agreed to first by Europe and China, and then hopefully America will come in to share this energy. You know, this only works if it's shared. We're learning now about climate change that everything we do, we share, even the bad things, whether it's pandemics or whether it's climate-related events, they all get shared around the world where no one's isolated. Everything we do affects someone else, some other creature, some other ecosystem, some other part of the planet. We need to understand with the new electricity internet coming together with the communication internet and the mobility internet, we have to learn to share. For example, as I said before, this forces sharing. If the sun is shining in one part of the world, you share the electricity with the other. If the wind is sharing in some other part of the world, you share it with the rest. I do not believe there's a lot of angst about one or more superpowers controlling this. That will not happen. I don't believe it's the intention of any of the superpowers to control this, but no superpower could. If America wanted to control this, they couldn't do it, or Europe or China, because the sun and the wind are distributed. You have to collect it everywhere where you work, where you live, in your neighborhoods. There's no centralized authority in the world, even if they wanted to, that could control all the sun and wind electricity that goes around the world, because you could easily go off grid. Anybody anywhere could go off grid and use their sun and wind locally. I don't think it's the intention of any of the superpowers to control, but to share. And I think China sees that as sharing as well. And so I think that it's very clear that the biosphere is our new community. In the biosphere, the boundaries aren't there. All the Earth's ecosystems and all the Earth spheres, the lithosphere, the biosphere, the magnetosphere, the hydrosphere, we share the spheres of the Earth. And we share the hydrological cycles of the Earth. And we share the circadian rhythms and the lunar rhythms of the Earth. And we share our destiny with the ecology of the planet. This infrastructure allows us to do that. It allows us to begin to learn that we're all in this together, not just as a species, but as part of the life of this beautiful planet. Having said that, I want to talk about just for a moment on labor and employment. While robots and AI will play an increasing role in how we manage this resilient zero carbon society infrastructure, in the short run, it's millions of jobs over the next 20 to 30 years. Robots and AI will not lay down underground cable under the land. Humans have to do that. Robots and AI do not install solar panels and wind turbines. Humans do that. Robots and AI do not retrofit buildings to make them weather resistant and put in insulation and new doors. Humans do that. Robots and AI do not lay out smart sensors across road systems. Humans do that. So this is going to mean millions of jobs. The new study we have not put out yet suggests that we will create in America in 20 years, in these 20-year period, if we do this right, 22 to 33 million net new jobs. This can happen everywhere. Now, in the long run, what's going to happen is as robots and AI become increasingly versatile over the next 20 years, there will be smaller workforces in the traditional economy. But the jobs are not going to go away, they're going to change. As we create a more streamlined and aggregate efficient infrastructure to manage our economy and therefore use less of the earth and share whatever we use and recycle it, as we learn to do that, and we have an economy where the actual communication internet converging with the energy internet, converging with the mobility internet, converging with the Internet of Things, the buildings become more, if you will, AI directed, the employment is going to shift. It already is. It's going to shift to public employment, to social employment. We're going to have millions and millions of individuals who will be responsible for managing disasters from environment and climate. We're going to need millions of individuals in public health to address increasing pandemics. They're going to come. And every few years, there'll probably be a pandemic. Then we'll have to shut down and go indoors. Then we'll find a vaccine. Then a few years later, we'll come out of the pandemic. It's not going to go away. So we're going to see millions of jobs as we AI this infrastructure and put in a lot of labor to do it. Millions of jobs in public health, in environmental disaster relief, in infrastructure recovery, in a whole set of relationships that only human beings can do. Only human beings. So I don't want anyone to tell me it can't be done. This 14th five-year plan is going to be crucial for the world. You're going to set the dynamic now after the 13th plan to how to move forward to a, if you will, a ecological civilization, a digital ecological civilization. But it's crucial that China in this next plan show the world how to begin this process and scale it, and really scale it quickly. And I have no doubt this can be done in 20 years. Bring the best of your governing infrastructure, your local businesses, your local regions, working with the national government to make this happen. We have no choice. I'm an old man. I won't be here to see this. But I'm saying to all my Chinese friends, young parents, young people who want to have a family, who want to have a future, it's now up to this generation to make sure that we don't quit or that we don't go back to a second industrial revolution, 20th century. And it's important that we move ahead with a new vision, an ecological civilization that can create a zero carbon society. And it's going to be up to China and a younger generation in China and in Europe, and hopefully in America next year, to join together and make this happen. One thing I've learned in my life is so precious. We don't see any life anywhere else in the universe. It's all quiet. We have a responsibility to allow those generations not yet here to enjoy their moment, not just humans. Our fellow creatures, they have every right to their journey on this planet so that we can maintain this beautiful thing called life and allow it to flourish in the future. So I congratulate China on the ecological civilization. I want China to be the spearhead of the zero carbon society along with the European Union. And I hope the 14th five-year plan says to the world, this can be done.